Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to episode 114 of 2-Minute Talk Tips, the podcast that opens with a practical public speaking tip in the first 2 minutes before getting into a deeper discussion about public speaking. Today's tip comes to us from special guest John Rohe.
The very effective tip they can use to be a more effective speaker is to not use filler words because they are very, very distracting. And so the way to do that is to have a friend of yours use a device that makes a very loud noise. And they make that loud noise with a bell or a clacker every time you use a non-word. And do that a couple times and you will quickly become aware of, and that's what you're looking for, awareness. You will become very quickly aware of what words you are using too often. Like awesome, like, And it's amazing that we get into a certain speaking pattern and we're simply unaware of how often we're saying things like right, like, those sorts of things. So I think it's important that if you're giving a talk, have a friend just sit there and all they're listening for are non-words. And every time you say a non-word, they make the noise. And it's amazing how quickly you will extinguish that behavior.
Stick around, and after the break, we'll hear more from John Rohe. Welcome back. One of the terms you hear in the training field, and likely other education-related fields as well, is the sage on the stage. It describes the lecture format in many educational contexts. The wise experts stand on the stage in the front of the room and imparts knowledge onto the lucky audience members. It's one-way communication, and it does have its place, but it can have a certain amount of arrogance associated with it as well. John Rohe is a speaker who eschews the lectern and the stage. He's a speaker and trainer in both the commercial and ecclesiastical fields, and one of the themes that comes through in this episode is the importance of humility with your audience. John's experience ranges from startups to established multi-billion-dollar enterprises. John launched the cardiac marker Pro-BNP for Roche Diagnostics and the first personalized health test and drug for osteoarthritis for Roche Pharma. John has taken products from R&D through FDA clearance. He's implemented user-friendly CRMs and automated quoting systems, and he integrated marketing, collateral, and Salesforce access. He's also been responsible for developing and implementing automated quoting and contracting systems. Through his company, High Cap Consulting, John helps speakers around the world learn and master confidence, repetition, passion, vocal modulation, brevity, audience connection, storytelling, and repetition. He also does strategy sessions and helps organizations refine their training and sales models to more effectively meet their goals. So now, let's meet John Rohe. Well, John, thank you so much for joining us here on 2-Minute Talk Tips this week.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
You've had quite a career and continue to have quite a career in managing lots of stuff, especially in that complicated medical space and the highly regulatory areas like that. But, to start, let's just go back to the beginning. So what's your earliest experience that you remember with public speaking?
The earliest is probably when I was very young and I was selected by the teacher to present a project to a class of people, and I loved it. I liked the attention. I liked having the control, and I knew that this was going to be a major part of my life going forward, and it has. So, and then later when I got into, as an adult, public speaking was part of my career path is as a registered nurse. So one of the things I had to do was present information to communities. So as a part of community health nursing, I would address large groups, and moderate groups, anywhere from 30 to 60, but they were a challenging group. At the time, I thought they were elderly. Now that I'm elderly, they seem like they were kids. And making sure that they could hear me and understand what I was trying to present, and always making sure that they had action items at the end of the conversation. And I found that served me extremely well when I got into industry. Whether I'm presenting to a group of physicians or med techs, medical technology students, or other nurses or patients, or more importantly, to people like the FDA or to potential users of the product, that it was critical that my speaking skills were excellent.
It's one of those things where, we start looking at having to be clear and having to provide results from our talks become so important there. And you're really getting into your professional public speaking career doing stuff that can have a direct impact on people's lives. And that's a pretty powerful thing.
It is. And it provides me with impetus to do very, very well. This isn't just reciting the alphabet or doing a stand-up routine. This is important because it does have to do with person's long-term health, how well they do. It's not just quantity of life, but it's also quality of life. So it puts a lot of pressure on me to do well, to do extremely well, and to provide the opportunity for them to ask questions. One of the things that I quickly learned was that if at the end of your conversation no one has any questions, you didn't do a good job. Some folks think that if at the end of the conversation there are no questions, great, I did fantastic. No, you're a psycho. You didn't do great. But that's more likely to point out is that they did not understand or they didn't care. And if they don't care, it's because you didn't initially sell why you had to be there. It's important that you always present up front the reason why they should care. Why should I listen to you? And oftentimes we think that it's obvious. No, it's not. You have to present initially always what is in it for the listener. Why should they listen? Why should they care? And if you don't do a good job of that, then you have an audience that's asleep. Eyes wide open, sound asleep.
And with their phones so readily accessible now, it's easier than ever for them to drift off. They don't even have to pretend to be sleeping with their eyes open.
Exactly. And that brings me to the other point is that as the speaker, you have the right to demand and require standard courtesy. And that courtesy includes the fact that you can ask people to please turn off their phones or to put them somewhere that is not accessible. If you're standing in front of a group of people and you see the tops of their heads, they're not praying, they're working their phones.
Yeah, you also said something that was really important there. And, talking about the reason they should pay attention, it should be obvious. Obvious is always a dangerous word for a speaker or a trainer, because what I found is that, even one of my challenges with this show sometimes is, when I'm producing tips or producing content, the things that as somebody who does this a lot, I think of as stupidly obvious and so simple, or stupidly obvious and so simple because I live and breathe this every day, but my audience doesn't.
Right. Exactly. You hit the nail right on the head, Bill. What is critical to me is often of no importance or value to others. So unless I sell it to them, why they should listen and why there should be a value, I'm just deluding myself.
The other thing you mentioned there that's also really interesting for new speakers as well is you mentioned the size of the crowd, whether it's going to be a large crowd or no, it was just a moderate crowd at, 30 to 60. One of the things I think is really interesting is that a crowd of, in that 50 to 100 range, that's one of the biggest crowds you're ever going to deal with, or that's going to feel big. Because once you get up above 100, you can't really see a lot of the folks in the audience, and you're not going to have them interacting with you as much as when it's a smaller crowd. That 50 to 100 can be one of the more intimidating groups.
Right, and I think it's important that you immediately become part of them. One of the things I always tell the associates that I work with, whether it's a CEO or a brand new sales rep or brand new floor manager, is that you want to be included as with them. So I have an advantage, Bill. I'm 6'2". So I have no problem if the audience is sitting to be seen. And that's true whether it's in a big ballroom or a classroom. And one of the things I never, ever do is stand behind a podium. That podium represents a distinction between you and them. And you're already setting yourself up as a target. So what I never use is a podium. Make sure that if your voice isn't strong, I have a loud voice. I have 11 brothers and sisters, so I learned very young how to be heard.
Sure.
But not everyone had that advantage. So if it's necessary to use a microphone, use it. If it's not, then don't. But I think the important thing is to not stand behind a podium. Why I referred to being 6'2", I rarely need a stage. I don't like stages. I don't like stages and I don't like podiums because there's a physical message that it's telling your audience, I'm smarter than you, or I'm the guy with the info. Now that may or may not be true, but you don't want to start your conversation already at a disadvantage. So I try to avoid the stage and the podium.
Those are both very, very important things. One of the things I've found where if logistically the podium or the lectern is required for additional paperwork, or if I have to have my computer there to run my slides or whatever, I find there's a lot of value in just turning it at an angle and standing next to it.
Yes, absolutely, Bill. That is a very good tip. Because you want to do everything you can to present the image and the language of the audience. The expectation should not be that the audience, I'm here to make the audience as good as me. That is a false distinction. You're not better than them. You just happen to have information that they don't have yet. So you want to be sure that that's how you present it, that you are not trying to set yourself up as better or different from your audience. And I've done that even when I've done international conferences, because you don't want to come off as the ugly American. And it's easy to do.
Sure.
Those are some very important things. The other thing that I think is critical for speakers is that they move around. I'm not talking about running up and down the aisles. I'm talking about slowly moving around the room. That does a couple things. One, it keeps them awake. It helps them to stay engaged because you're now moving about the room. So they actually have to physically move in their seats. One of the big problems that speakers have is that people get glued to their seat, and you don't want them to do that. If during your conversation, and that's how I do my talks, as a conversation. I'm not the college professor lecturing. I'm having a conversation with you. It's important to tell the story of what you're presenting. And you have to present it in a way that is engaging. And one of the ways to engage is to simply move around. Don't glue to one seat. Don't just stand in one position. It's important that you move about. One of my favorite tricks is to, especially if it's new information to me, because sometimes I get into situations where the content is actually already written and they're using me strictly as a delivery vehicle. So there are slides, and be sure that the slides only have the base information. You don't put text on a slide. But so as you move around, if you're in the front of the room and you look at the slide, that's obvious. If you're in the back of the room or the side of the room and you glance up at the slide, that's not so obvious.
Plus, if you're in the back of the room and you glance up at the slide and you can't read it, then that also tells you need to redesign that slide.
Yes. Oh, yes. That is fantastic. Yes, exactly. And the other part about being in the room is if you do have, say you have a particular quote on a slide that you want to use as a base for the next part of that story, it is very smart to have someone from the audience read it out loud. That's why anytime I'm in a large room, especially you're talking about anywhere from 50 to 500, I make sure that I have at least 2 microphones. One for me, and then one to hand to a participant in the room. And if you do that early, that also keeps them engaged, because now everybody in the room's like, oh God, I have to pay attention. He might call on me. So I often will have an audience member read the quote from the slide. And that's another way of engaging the audience with you. It's important. Audience engagement is critical to any successful discussion, presentation, training, education. And that is one of the critical ways to do it, is to have the audience, someone in the audience, participate in the presentation.
And one of those other things that happens too is that when somebody says something out loud, even if they're just reading it, it starts to associate in their minds, and they will start to believe that to be true just because it has come out in their voice.
Exactly. They get ownership. And that is so critical, that your audience gets ownership of the discussion, of the presentation. And that's one of the ways you do this. And it's not something that comes magically overnight. It's a question of confidence. And confidence of the speaker is absolutely required for success. And you can fake confidence. And what you'll discover is that if you fake confidence initially, eventually it's real. If you're not confident in what you're presenting and what you're talking about, people will catch it and immediately cut you off.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the, I don't generally get nervous before I speak, but those times that I do, usually it's because I don't know my material well enough, and I haven't done enough of my prep, and it's a confidence thing in those cases.
It really is. You really have to know what you're talking about if you can. But as I said, if you get really good as a presenter, you may discover that you're getting jobs as a presenter without your content. It's not your content. And sometimes it's hard to come up to speed fast enough.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have an internal confidence, then that projects, and that does wonders for the success of the discussion.
Yeah, exactly. So some of the things you're talking about here are unique to or to a specific type of speaking, and that is working as a trainer. And that's becomes a lot more common. That's a scenario where it's a lot more common to be given somebody else's material where you're going to facilitate a session, or the extra importance of moving around the room and speaking from different places in the room when your talk is not going to be 20 minutes long, but it's going to be spread over the course of 3 hours or 6 hours with the same group, to educate them, to get them up to speed on this new material, this new process, whatever it is. So how did you get into learning and development work?
I got into learning and development. Well, first of all, as part of the profession, as a registered nurse, education is part of your license. You have to be able to educate. And then when I moved into industry, what I discovered was that a lot of very good material and important material was being lost because it simply was not being presented in a way that was meaningful to the audience. One of the things about training is that everybody thinks they can be a trainer.
Huh.
So what happened early in my career is, so someone from marketing, they would be in charge of a product, and they would come in and tell everybody about their new product, and they would tell it in a way that nobody cared, but they had a lack of self-awareness. So what I did was I went to our regional manager and then ultimately to the vice president and said to them, I said, you do realize that a lot of this material is being lost in the delivery. These people have no experience in training, they have no experience in public speaking, and I think you really need a trainer. You need someone who knows how to train. And training and education, the way I distinguish it in my mind, is training is to the task, how to do something specific, step A, B, C, D, and they're in that order. Education is choice. So what you do is you present the material, but then they have to be able to choose whether I should go from A to B or A to C or skip D. So education means that I have to use the information, but use it in a way that I have to choose how it is used. Training is a task. There is no choice. You simply will do things this way. I like to use something that most people can relate to is on an expense report, how you fill out the expense report. The steps of the expense report are task-oriented. Whether or not that expense is actually a legitimate expense to the company is education. So if I take my brother-in-law to lunch to have a nice lunch, that's not a company expense. But if my brother-in-law happens to be the buyer or the buying agent for a company to whom we are selling, then it is a legitimate expense. So education tells me whether or not it's a legitimate expense. Training tells me how to fill out the form, where to put the dollar sign, where to put the name of the person, that sort of thing. So that, in my mind, is the distinction between training and education. And people, including people, professionals, don't understand the difference. And oftentimes will use what I consider inappropriate modalities to provide the information. Task, and this is strictly my opinion, of course, but I think that task-specific information is easily transferred to electronic training. Education, you need virtual or some kind of interactive or live, because you want to see them demonstrate the skill. It's the whole concept of the different levels of assessment.
And when I used to train folks how to sell computers, I spent very little time talking about specific speeds and feeds and features on the machines, because what I would tell them is, look, you're all presumably literate. You can go ahead and read a spec sheet. You don't need me to stand up here and do that to you.
Correct. And when I took over the training department, when Roche Diagnostics brought me in to their training department, the very first thing I did was move knowledge sets out of the classroom. Because as you said, people can read. You can't be hired without a college degree. So by definition, everyone in the room had a degree. They know how to pick up knowledge. They know how to study. So what I did was I moved the knowledge set out of the classroom. So rather than me standing up front and giving specs, exactly what you said, specs on the different equipment and reagent, they had to learn that ahead of time. And then when they came into the classroom, then we had scenarios where they would, okay, now you're going to present this, you're going to sell this product. So what of the specs of the analyzer are you going to tell me? And that's a trick question, because you're not going to tell me anything. What you start with is a question. What am I interested in? What am I looking for? And I think that is so important as a presenter, that you're willing to use questions. There is nothing wrong with asking either rhetorical questions or asking questions for which you expect an answer from the audience. Hence the second microphone.
Exactly. I think one of the other things you mentioned there too that's also really interesting, when you talked about the marketing folks or the product folks coming in and just not being as effective at training, that talks too about what we were talking about earlier with what's obvious to folks, because I have worked with some absolutely amazing product marketing folks who know their stuff inside and out, and they have the top 5 reasons to buy this, the top 5 for that. And when you put them in front of the actual audience, that's stuff that doesn't make sense to the audience, because the audience is in a very different world. An audience who wants to know, okay, why should I sell this to my customer, as opposed to what did we do to make this an awesome product? Those are two very different conversations, and you need someone often in learning and development or brand evangelism or sales training or whatever you want to call it in your organization to provide that translation or that interpretation between those different camps.
That's so critical, Bill, because oftentimes what happens is, because they're so wound up in it, they do what I call and I didn't invent it, I just like the term, show up and throw up.
Yeah.
So what happens is they come in and they just blow through specs, but they never point out what that specific spec does for whom. So as a result, the audience, they're off. They're asleep, eyes wide open, sleeping, because they don't understand what that person is really talking about. It's great material, but they can't relate to it. And that's why, as a speaker, it's so important that you tell a story. People love stories. So you have to present the data in a way with a story that resonates with your audience. One of the products I had launched at another company was a test for heart failure. Now, you would think that if I get up front and I tell them that, we have the best thing since sliced bread, it's going to help you diagnose heart failure, everyone would immediately be interested in it, because heart failure is a major health problem in the country, in the world, and that if you live long enough, you too will have heart failure. But the audience doesn't know that. So just telling them about all the wonderful advantages of being able to diagnose heart failure early has no resonance. So you have to tell the story of what heart failure does and why it should be important to them. So that's why the story is so critical as you try to transfer knowledge and skills.
Absolutely. The storytelling is so critical for resonating with the audience and for giving them something to remember, because they will remember the story long before they remember any exposition.
Correct.
The other thing that's really important here too is that when we talk about the folks who come there, they show up and they throw up and they deliver this material. The other thing that happens in the background is that they can check the box that says they did the training.
Yes.
Folks didn't learn anything or retain any material. So now at a corporate level, you look at that and go, we did training. It didn't do anything. Training doesn't work.
Yes,
When,
exactly.
and that hurts the whole industry.
Terribly. One of the things that I'm constantly harping on is ROI, return on investment. And when I say return on investment, I'm speaking dollars and cents. One of the things that you cannot take to the bank are likes and clicks. You have to take cash. And I think, Bill, that we as trainers and educators do our industry and our profession a disservice by saying silly things like, well, there's no real way to determine what the financial impact is. Well, if you can't determine the financial impact, you just lost the CFO, the CEO, and the board of directors. Why should we do something unless we know that if we invest $1 million in training, that we're going to get back $5 million? Why should we do it? You're not a charity. Whether you're the Roman Catholic Church or General Motors, if you have no margin, you have no mission. So it's important that we as trainers, the professionals, have to have a way to come up with ROI. And I think that oftentimes we get a little lazy and say, well, there's really no way to determine the ROI. I have found that to be untrue. If you work at it, you can determine an ROI. And without the ROI, you lose funding. And that's one of the reasons why oftentimes when companies run into problems, what's one of the first departments they cut?
Absolutely. They cut training rather than focusing on trying to get more value from the employees and drive higher productivity. You cut the tool that can help you drive that higher productivity.
Exactly. And I think sometimes it's our own fault.
So do you think the Kirkpatrick framework for ROI is valuable then, or is there a better approach for evaluating ROI in learning and development?
I think the Kirkpatrick system is very good, but you don't even have to do something that elaborate. I think that if you have the data, I'm a very data-driven person. I'm into science and to data. I will be very happy to listen to your opinion, but unless you have data to support it, it's really not that valuable to me. If you just use the common sense data, you can come up with an ROI. What is the current performance? What is the current financial performance of the individual of your organization? Now, I'm going to provide training. Now, what is the expected improvement of that performance? And then you take that expected improvement and you apply it to the financial performance. Let me give an example of that. If a person is generating $50,000 in revenue, which means they're probably working for minimum wage, but they're generating $50,000. Now I come to you as a trainer and say, look, if we do this training, we can improve their performance by 10%. That 10% is worth $5,000. And we will track that person to see if it occurs. We have to be willing as professionals, either we deliver or we shut up. I think sometimes we do things that are nice, but not of value. This is a real quick aside. I was asked by a company, a well-known Fortune 100 company, to come in and develop a leadership program for their salespeople, which I think is fantastic. Oftentimes we worry about the new employee onboarding and that sort of thing, but we forget about the seasoned vet. And so why should I stay at this company? They really don't do anything for me. They don't help me with my professional skills. And so what happens is over 5-10 years, the seasoned vets, you'll see that oftentimes their performance starts dropping. And when I say performance, I strictly mean dollars and cents. How much money are they generating and how much are they costing? We have to get to the hard facts. So they asked me to come in and provide a leadership program, which I was more than happy to do because, as I said, I think it's so important that we do something for our seasoned employees, and the leadership program is fantastic. So when I went to the meeting, I asked them, so what is the value of the leadership program to the rep? Well, they'll get better skills. They'll show that it shows them that we love them. All these very nice, flowery, very, very important, but flowery statements. And I said to them, what is the dollar and cents value to the person who goes through this program? Will they have a leg up on promotion? Will they be given a boost in pay? What is the financial gain for them to participate in this leadership program? They had no idea. They had no idea. They said, well, we just want to offer it to them to be nice. And I said, well, that's great. That's nice. But what is the financial reason why a rep who's doing just fine should do anything different than what they're currently doing to make more money? And that's the bottom line for why people work. If you need family or friends, you go on Facebook. You go to work to make money. So we had to back that whole leadership program back up, and management had to come in and say, what will you commit to for the person who participates in this from a financial view? Before there's any talk about what the content of the leadership program is.
And that's especially important when you're talking to a commissioned sales force, when anytime they spend going to training is money out of their pocket because they're not spending that time selling.
Exactly. You have to justify, just like as a speaker, the first thing you do as a speaker, the content must begin with, why should the audience listen to you? You start with that. And for the same reason, you don't do a training program unless there's a reason why they should give up that time doing their job.
Yeah, exactly. You've got to be able to provide that value and show that value. And the way we do that is continuing to evolve. I think we're probably seeing a lot more data available now than we have in the past. But what are you seeing as the big changes in learning and development over the last 15 years?
I think the biggest changes is the use of technology to make assessments and performance easier. The days of the massive paper and pencil testing are gone. If you're doing paper and pencil testing, you're the last century. So I see what happening with technology is that it's being moved over to better and easier ways to assess and also to deliver. As I said, the technology, the electronic way of transferring knowledge has to be used. It's extremely effective. And then I was working with another company. They have a product that uses it as a part of assessment. And it's all by voice. So after you've completed the training program, then as you go back into your job over the next month or so, you at your leisure, you call into a specific number, and this is all by voice. So on your smartphone, you tell Siri or Tony or Fred or whatever to call this number or call this sort of group, and they will, an automated voice will take you through the questions. So you're answering the questions just as a part of your life, as opposed to taking time out of your life to take a test. And that also provides a fantastic way of reinforcement. That's one of the other things that oftentimes get is the reinforcement and remediation. And those are two critical parts of any training. And so you can do that electronically, so that if the rep is out in the field and he wants to talk about a specific product, he can pull up the information on his smartphone or his I know iPad is a trade name, a flat screen, whatever it is. And they can pull the information up right there in front of them. So it's training at the point of need. A good friend of mine, often that's his biggest thing, is training at the point of need. He says that we waste hours and hours training people on everything when the person only needs a specific piece of it. So that if we move the training from the classroom, the knowledge piece from the classroom, then the participant has that knowledge at their fingertips and they can pull it up at the place of need, at the place and time of need. And I see that as a huge change over the past 15, 20 years.
And that information, then that also then connects more directly with what we were talking about earlier, which is about how you have to connect with your audience. You have to make sure they see a reason for attending that talk and for listening. When they're learning at the point of need, it's because they have an actual need at that point in time. They're bringing their why bring that up to you.
Correct. And they will know it. It's funny that as we go through life, and I'm sure if you think back, for me, it's back in the dark ages when I was in school, the information I knew the best at the end of the year were the questions I got wrong on the test. I would never get that question wrong again. And so I think that that's important as well, that we provide the information that is needed at the time and place of need, rather than, the scattergram approach. We're going to just show up and throw up. Somewhere in there is something you'll need. We don't know what it is or when you'll need it, but it's there somewhere, so you have to know everything. And that's not accurate. I had a really good teacher in grade school that said that it's more important to know where to find the correct information than to memorize the information. And I think that that's true for training as well, that it's oftentimes more important to train the participants on where the information is coming from and how they can access it, rather than expecting them to memorize it.
I'd rather teach folks how to read and understand a spec sheet than teach them a spec sheet.
That is exactly correct.
So we've got all these new assessment tools, and that is excellent. It's really helping, again, with what we were talking about with ROI, better assessment, where it's needed, when you can find out. But you also have to be able to quickly assess the impact of a speaker. And how do you do that?
You do that by looking around the room. I'm a very strong student of body language. So the way I assess a speaker is by looking around the room. How many people are engaged? How many people are looking at the speaker or at the slide? How many of them are looking at their lap or their smartphone? How many are engaged in side conversations? That's what tells me if you have a great speaker. If you have a speaker who is very good at what they do, then people should be engaged with that speaker. So I'm a very strong believer in body language and looking around the room to see if that speaker has engaged the audience. The other things are just the mundane. Are they using filler words? Are they knowledgeable or appear to be knowledgeable of the material? Are they speaking to the audience? Are they looking down at their notes? Are they reading slides to me? So those are all the important parts. Are they moving around? Are they physically engaging the audience? Are they glued to one spot? Or are they actually engaged in the room? So those are the ways that I assess speakers. there are people that are in the public eye right now, some of whom are excellent and some of whom are just dreadful, dreadful. Senator Dole, when she was running for president back in the last century, I was always impressed with that woman because you never found her standing behind a podium screaming at the audience. She was down, and she wasn't that tall of a woman, but she had a neck microphone on, and she would be in the audience talking to them, engaging them, asking them questions, getting them, the audience, to say the correct answer. And I was very much impressed by her, that she really knew, to use an old phrase, work a room. And I think it's important that speakers be able to do that. So that's how I judge speakers. Are they engaging with the room?
Because ultimately it is all about that audience and how you're going to connect with that audience. And you've been able to connect with a whole bunch of different audience types, everything from 7th graders to CEOs. And what do those types of audiences have in common, though?
They are all looking for personal improvement. They're all looking for the ability to stand up straight and smile and say, I did it. It is truly heartwarming to have a CEO of a Fortune 100 company. The person is making, probably in excess of $15 to $20 million, and they get a smile just like a 7-year-old on their face at the end of the program when they know they've nailed it. And the smile is the same. The smile is the same. You can see that the inner light is shining extremely bright. And it's true across the board. It's just a feature of humanity. Everyone wants to do well.
That is excellent. And, that makes so much sense. So thanks for that, John. And, thank you so much for joining us this week. If folks want to know more about you and what you're up to, where should they go?
They can probably go to my website, which is hycap.org, www.hycap.org, or I'm more than willing to have them send me a email at john.rohe, ROHE, at hycap.org. Feel free to send me an email or go to my website, and I'll be more than happy to assist you in any way I can.
Excellent. And we'll also have those links available over at 2minutetalktips.com in the show notes for this episode. So, John, this has been absolutely fantastic. I really like the depth we went into on some of these topics, especially on learning and development and some of these other areas. I think this has been really valuable for the audience.
I want to impress upon your audience that we have a fantastic profession, and it is a profession. And just because everybody who shows up thinks that they're a trainer, just smile because you know they're not. Thanks a lot, Bill. This was wonderful.
John made a list of things that he looks for when evaluating a speaker. You'll find that list over at 2minutetalktips.com/John Rowe. We also talked about the Kirkpatrick framework for evaluating training effectiveness. This framework has 4 levels. As you evaluate the performance of a training program, you look at these questions. How do the learners feel about their training experience? How effectively did the learners acquire new skills or knowledge? How effectively did the learners apply what they learned in the training? And how effectively did the training ultimately meet its goals for the organization? Each level gets closer to demonstrating the actual ROI of the training expense for the organization. There are tons of books out there exploring this topic in greater detail, but what I like about it is how it takes an abstract question like, was the training worth it, and makes it more concrete. It gives us ways to look at the question from different levels of the organization. We cover a lot of overall best practices in this conversation, but the theme of humility is really what jumps out at me most. Our job as speakers and trainers is not to make the audience think we're smart, though that does have a part to play in establishing credibility. Ultimately, it's to give the audience members the tools they need to improve their lives, commercially, medically, financially, and spiritually. So design your talk with your audience in mind. Involve them in the content. Make sure your slides are visible to everyone. Listen to your audience and listen to their concerns. It's another side of the servant leadership idea we talked about with Lyle Tard last week, or the importance of caring and connection we talked about 2 weeks ago with Richard Kaufman. So check out the work John is doing at hycap.org, hycap.org, or just head on over to 2minutetalktips.com/John Rohe for that link and more. Share this episode with another speaker or trainer by giving them the link, 2minutetalktips.com/John Rohe. And of course, as always, don't get best. Get better. Thanks a lot. I'm Bill Monroe, and I'll talk to you next week.
Two-Minute Talk Tips is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.